Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pitts. Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 13th of January 2024. Remember that's 2024. We're going to start in the military aid and equipment section, and we're going to go back to Rishi Sunak, the UK Prime Minister, and a £2.5 billion package that the UK signed off for Ukraine yesterday. This is an uptick of £200 million from the aid package given, or the aid budget, I guess, given to Ukraine last year. So this is, giving more than last year, which is a really good sign from the UK. So start with the positives here. So important historic speech, says Denis Shmyhal, the Prime Minister of Ukraine, by Rishi Sunak to Ukraine's parliament. Will support Ukraine for as long as it takes. An agreement on security guarantees for Ukraine was signed today. Prime Minister also announced a new military aid package totaling £2.5 billion. We are moving towards victory together, he said. And here you get this. So I just want to play you this because of the psychological impact on something like this. Now, I've talked about this previously with regard to Boris Johnson, right? Boris Johnson was having a time of failure in UK domestic politics. Wherever you sit on the spectrum, this is like objectively true. So he is really unpopular for all the stuff that happened in COVID, where he set all these restrictions for people's movement in COVID. People couldn't go to their own family members' funerals, and yet he was literally he himself having parties with Downing Street aides and whatnot, and all this kind of carry on. Now there's now an inquiry going into this, and it's all highly controversial. So he was ousted for basically lying and deceit and yada yada yada, which was actually formed for him because he had lost at least two prior jobs, one with the Daily Telegraph and one from Howard, the previous Conservative leader, for lying. So he lost two, maybe three previous jobs for lying, and then he essentially lost his prime ministership for lying. Anyway, what happened with Ukraine was fascinating because he realized that in Ukraine he was deeply, deeply popular, and for good reason. Like, he was very strong on Ukraine, and the best thing I think he ever did as prime minister was everything to do with Ukraine, like the rhetoric, the positioning, the being ahead of the curve in terms of military aid, etc., etc. And so, as a result, the Ukrainians have a lot of love for, and had a lot of love for, Boris Johnson. So when he went to Ukraine, he was treated as some kind of almost divine figure, right? And they were making croissants of his likeness in the bakeries, and they had street names named after him, and etc., etc., etc. And we must recognize that politicians are humans, right? And if you are in domestic politics in a two-party, very narrow, first past the post electoral system is very divisive. We see this in the US and we see this in the UK. So where you broadly got two parties, even worse in the US. And so the electorate becomes very polarized. This is a massive problem in America, where Joe Biden becomes president and 50% of the population absolutely despise him. No matter what he does with the economy, with whatever, any good things he does, 50% of the population will despise him. There's nothing he can do to make that 50% like him. For Donald Trump, it's exactly the same. 50% of the population absolutely despise him. There's nothing that he can do that will make those people like him. And so you have this very, what must be a fractured existence psychologically for any kind of politician in that position, where in your own country, like, half the people hate you. You go to somewhere like Ukraine and everyone loves you. You're thinking, oh my God, I feel really good about Ukraine. So then you start saying, right, I'm going to keep doing really good things for Ukraine and with Ukraine, because actually, when I visit there, they just absolutely love me for it. And actually, with Boris Johnson, people appreciated him back in the UK, like myself, who didn't like Boris Johnson, but liked him for his stance on Ukraine. So actually, he gained political points, if you like, for what he was doing abroad in Ukraine. And then you look at Rishi Sunak, who isn't particularly popular. He's not like massively unpopular. He's just a bit meh, right? There's a lot of meh for him. But then look at in the Verkhovna Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, here's a situation where he is unfurling the Union flag with an awful lot of pride, okay? And that's not necessarily something that's been easy to do for the last sort of 40 years. So for someone like Rishi Sunak, I think this is super important, because I think this is almost like a Boris Johnson moment for him, where he goes, and just from a really personal psychological point of view, this is awesome. Look, they're shaking my hand. They're putting their hands on their hearts. I'm getting a hug from one of the most popular international politicians in the world. People are just constantly giving me claps here. This is a standing ovation. And I've done a relatively simple thing, which is commit the UK to support Ukraine. I say relatively simple because there's so much support for that domestically. So this is a win-win for him. This is it's a win for global security. It's a win for the UK. It's got all the geopolitical strategic gains, but it's also a gain for me, Rishi Sunak, in terms of the personal psychology of this, with all these people appreciating me and me feeling good about myself. But also I can score some points back at home with people like Jonathan M.S. Pearce, who's like, yeah, not really big fan of the Conservatives, not really big fan of Rishi Sunak. Oh, this is good though. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's good. And actually, in the kind of the bar chart of my level of appreciation for Rishi Sunak, there is undoubtedly going to have been a spike upwards as a result of yesterday's activities. So this is a good bit of politicking going on. Now, the negative here. So John Sweeney, who I've interviewed, go and check it out on the live tab. 10 out of 10 for PR, Rishi Sunak. But where is the defence infrastructure to deliver on this guarantee? E.g., the factory that built the Challenger 2 tank is now a housing estate. We need to rearm Britain now and double our aid to Ukraine. So on the one hand, I really congratulate Rishi Sunak and our government. I did that yesterday, but I did say that £2.5 billion compared to $61 billion that's albeit held up in the US, that's a very different number, right? And so, yes, this is great. And hopefully it will get other people moving. But is it really enough? And I don't want to be overly negative on the back of it's as if, well, nothing's good enough, right? Because I'm anti-conservative. And I'm not trying to be like that. But I was generally upbeat yesterday about the British situation. And again, paving the way. Here we have Charles Michel. Actually, no, I don't want to go on to that yet. Here we have Thomas Tyner saying Paul Mason is 100% correct here. So first of all, let's go to Paul Mason. And who is he? Paul Mason is a left-wing journalist who I think is now involved formally in the Labour Party in the UK. And he said, Rishi's off to Ukraine, but £2.5 billion is not enough when Russia is doubling its defence spending. What's really important here, and this is what's wonderful about the UK at the moment, here we have a left-wing Labour Party criticism of Rishi Sunak. But instead, and say in the US, where you've got the Republicans criticizing Biden's stance on Ukraine, generally the Republicans are saying we shouldn't put any money towards this, or, Southern Border First or whatever. Paul Mason here, this is the difference between the UK and the US in terms of the bipartisan support for Ukraine in the UK is so overwhelming. He's saying his criticism of Rishi Sunak is, yeah, well done, mate. That's not enough. It needs to be more. And this is fascinating, but this is good news going forward, and I'll explain in a second. So Rishi's off to Ukraine, but £2.5 billion is not enough when Russia is doubling its defence spending. We should be rearming UK for self-defence and massively increasing arms to Kyiv. Expensive, yes, not as expensive as having to invoke Article 5 when their next aggression begins. Learn the lessons our grandparents learned. This is good rhetoric from Paul Mason, and I'm not trying to be opportunistic in criticising Rishi Sunak, because at the end of the day, this is Thomas Tyner, who's showed himself to be really quite right-wing of late. So he is not a big fan of the left and is consistently slagging off the left. But he's saying Paul is 100% correct. 2% of GDP defence spending is the level to retain capabilities. That's like your bare minimum. 3% is when you're faced with threats. 4% is when war looms. Poland and the US are spending about 4%. The rest of Europe, all way too little. Now, lots of the rest of Europe have upped it to over 2%. Now there are 11 countries, and that's growing, it appears, to achieving the 2% of GDP defence spending to be in line with the criteria for accession to NATO, or for being in NATO. But Thomas Tyner is saying, actually, this is a time of war looming. We need to be spending actually more than that, not going the bare minimum, but going the full hog. I find this fascinating because this then puts the UK in a really good position going forward, because it means that whoever takes over now in government is not going to be an issue for the UK. We have such strong bipartisan support that Russia, that Ukraine are in a good place going forward. Now, moving on to the EU here, we have Charles Michel, who's the president of the European Council. We have various tools to ensure that Ukraine can count on our support. There is a long political will of 26 leaders, obviously not 27 leaders, 26 leaders to adopt this mega package. And this is the signal we want to send Ukraine. So there is this talk about the money eventually being able to get through, even though Viktor Orban is not a big fan. Sorry, I did have that out of place twice. So this is what I wanted to go back to. So Michael Weiss saying here, the one country Ukraine needn't worry about is UK. So he's then referring back to Paul Mason, what he said. But Paul Mason also said, it's a historic moment, and I am determined that the next Labour government, and if he's formally involved in that, it's then is more likely that this is going to happen. Actually, when you listen to the rhetoric of Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, and the shadow Labour Defence Secretary, then things are in a good place for Ukraine. So he says, I'm determined that the next Labour government builds on it to deter any further aggression by Putin's fascists. And that's in response to Volodymyr Zelensky saying, this day is already part of Ukrainian history. We have reached a security agreement with the UK that we have long worked on. This is the first such agreement based on the G7 Vilnius Declaration. The agreement covered many aspects: direct annual support, fixed financial assistance, £2.5 billion this year, significant annual support through the agreement's 10-year term, weapons, support for our defence sector, the work of our intelligence services, sanctions against Russia, cyber defence against Russian cyber attacks, and everything involving modern technology. This is genuinely serious and modern agreement. There are well-known exemplary security agreements from the 20th century, such as the one between the US and Israel, and as well as other similar agreements. We have now created a modern-day example that boosts our confidence while we defend ourselves against Russian aggression, and that lays the groundwork for strong security positions until Ukraine joins NATO. NATO membership remains our priority security goal. Meanwhile, we are working with other partners on bilateral security agreements based on our agreement with the UK. So again, the UK ahead of the curve there in terms of what their security agreement looks like. I don't know what the details are, but Zelensky seems to be very happy with what's been put on paper and what's been almost contractually agreed upon between the two nations. And he's saying that all future security agreements are going to be based on the Ukraine UK one. Almost 30 states have already joined the G7 Vilnius Declaration. I am grateful to every country and every leader who's already working with us on this, and to everyone who will be joining this year. And I'm most grateful to the UK and personally to Prime Minister Rishi Sunak for their leadership. So this is all the good news. Obviously, the question still remains is, could there still be more? But Charles Michel then committing EU to being able to break that impasse concerning Viktor Orban. And then here we have, moving on, Canadian company Rochelle Defence. So this is a defence manufacturer that makes the Senator armoured personnel vehicles that were originally based on security vehicles that you'd move money around within cities. So they're not like, you wouldn't necessarily use these right in the front line and whatnot, but they seem to be pretty decent vehicles. They've already delivered an absolute ton of these. Like, I think maybe 1,000 of these have already gone to Ukraine. And it is run by a Canadian-Ukrainian company, and the company employs, I think, a bunch of Ukrainian refugees as well. So there's a lot of connection between this company and Ukraine, and it's why they're pushing so hard on building things for Ukraine. And he is saying that more than 100 Senator armored vehicles of various modifications are in its warehouse, ready for immediate delivery to Ukraine. Well, 100 ready to go. In addition, a new version has appeared, details of which will be announced soon. So that's good news, and they're obviously getting into the defense market. I've got a mate who's just got into he was a tank commander. He's now in the private sector. In one particular sector that they were working on this, and the markup was whatever. And he's like gone to work for this new company, and they're getting into the defense sector. And he's like, and bosses are really happy with all the contacts and us moving in that direction, because the markup is a lot. I mean, defense, it's the risk involved, I guess. But when you are making an APC for the army compared to an APC for G4 security to move like money for a bank, you can bet your bottom dollar the one for the army, even if they're pretty much the same vehicle, the one for the army is going to be like £20,000 more. Interesting. Anyway, the Swedish Defence Material Administration has signed an agreement with Nammo to invest in production capacity of 155mm artillery ammunition in Sweden. We talked about this on the Tochny podcast that I've then mirrored I mirrored it a couple of days ago. Go and watch that. That's my extra, I think, from 2 days ago. They were talking, the guy, I think was it Colby Badwar, was talking about Nammo. Here we have an agreement to invest in production capacity of 155mm artillery ammunition in Sweden. Nammo has a facility in Karlskoga in which 155mm load, assemble and pack is conducted. Now, this is almost 2 years into the war and the Swedish Defence Material Administration has just signed that agreement. This is good news, but it does prompt the question, why is it taking you that long to sign that agreement? My goodness, we've known for absolutely ages that they are desperate for 155mm artillery ammunition. Good, but now? And not then? Anyway, Ukrainian diaspora asks Australia to send 45 retired helicopters to Ukraine. The Ukrainian diaspora group in Australia has appealed on January the 12th to the Australian government to supply Ukraine with 45 retired Taipan helicopters rather than scrapping them. These are the sorts of helicopters that Ukraine would really need. I mean, they need all sorts of helicopters. There was an interesting moment in my interview with Daniela on the Extra yesterday talking about artillery barrels, but we also talked, it was a wide-ranging discussion, we talked of other things, and he said there is a good theory that we should be sending the very best equipment rather than just stuff that we've got that we get that's gone obsolete, because actually when the Ukrainian troops are at a disadvantage in number, 44 million compared to 140 million in a country, you need to use the best equipment to trip the Russians at the most preferable ratios. And if you just give them something which is great and it's good and they need it, but it's good, but it's not great, then that will challenge them being able to achieve the attrition rates that they need. But something like this, if it's like a military helicopter used for transportation rather than being an attack helicopter particularly, then 45 Taipans are going to be super cool, no doubt. Right, this is interesting. I don't know what to make of this. So the Ukrainian commander said Ukraine needs more attack aircraft. Ukraine requires more attack aircraft, including jets, to support infantry and planes to fire long-range missiles, Ground Forces Commander Alexander Syrsky said in an interview with Reuters. Now, some people have been criticising this. I think maybe Colby Badwar might have said this, was it again? Or someone, maybe John Ridge. Someone saying, hang on, no, I think it might have been Justin Bront from... No, sorry. Shashank Joshi from The Economist was saying these would just get shot down straight away. I can't believe that someone's just been asking for F-16s and got them, is now asking for these. They would go with the situation with air defenses. These wouldn't last 5 minutes, is what he said. They wouldn't last 5 minutes, and this is definitely true. Has been true. I wonder whether there's a shift. Whether this is a kind of an admission from Syrsky that the Ukrainians have actually done a really good job of shooting air defenses. Destroying enemy air defense pieces. We have seen more and more air defense units be attrited, and at some point there will be a tipping point, one would hope, whereby the skies are less contested in favor of Ukraine. If Ukraine can keep that attrition up, then could there be a point when such aircraft might be usable? I don't know, but I don't think that point is yet. And A-10s, they sound great, and they would basically, you'd just carpet bomb these areas with them, but it completely revolves around them not being able to be shot out the sky by Strelas and Osas and S-300s and whatever else books that the Russians have pointed at them. Okay, Colby Badwa here talks about the CEO of MBDA who's come out and said, so they're the company, the multinational company that makes Storm Shadow, Scalp, Taurus missiles. This is a bold statement by the CEO that the integration of those missiles was completed, quote, in a few weeks, in many magnitudes faster than all previous reports have suggested it took. There were claims originally, there were claims that the Taurus can't be fitted, it would take a year and a half to fit it to F-16s or whatever. Yeah, but that's kind of what you're saying about Storm Shadow and Scalp, and he's now saying it took a few weeks. There's absolutely no excuse, some might say, for not trying to fit Taurus to the same airframes. We were able to adapt Scalp Storm Shadow missiles on Ukrainian Su-24 fighter jets in a few weeks when it would normally have taken years. Years to a few weeks is phenomenal. We managed to do it very quickly because we had design authority. That is to say, capacity and legitimacy to make decisions and make technical choices. Yep, that's just like Ukraine and the US and whoever and the UK, so not so much the US actually, because this will be European. I was thinking F-16s, but this is on the Su-24s. So you've got Ukrainian authorities and UK European authorities saying, do whatever you need to do to get those missiles on that plane. Just do it, right? So rather than having to jump through regulatory hoops over a several year period, if they were like designing this back in peacetime, they're like, just get it done. They got it done. We need this. Yep, you've got that. We need that. Yeah, you've got that. Okay, do it. 2 weeks. Oh, 2 weeks, not 2 years. Brilliant. Okay, you're saying it takes a year and a half to put the Taurus on the F-16. Do it. Do it. Do it. And guaranteed they could do that in pretty short time. 15-year-old schoolboy wanted to fight for Ukraine was detained in Poland. The teenager left home but was not at school. The schoolboy was found already on the Polish-Ukrainian border, reports a Polish source here. The police have returned the schoolboy to his home in Ostrava in the Czech Republic. My goodness. So I wouldn't advise this. I've kept this in the military aid to Ukraine, but I don't think they're going to get an awful lot of benefit out of 15-year-old schoolboys coming across from Europe. But interesting that he would feel that strong about the war to do that. Says an awful lot, doesn't it? Russian Telegram channels are reporting here in this video that foreign mercenaries are fighting for Russia. Here we've got Somalian, Indian and Syrian personnel in, I think, one video. It just goes to show what Russia are doing to get troops on the front line, which itself is reflective, I think, of the desperation they have to get boots on the ground. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens on March the 17th after the presidential elections. On the one hand, I think Russia are in a really kind of good position, comparatively speaking, if they can get 30,000 a month. On the other hand, is that really sustainable? If they're having to do stuff like that, then I'm not sure how sustainable that really is. Can they keep going around the world, extracting people? There's talk about getting them out of prisons in Cape Verde and whatnot. So I don't know how sustainable that is, but at 30,000 a month, if they are getting that many, then Ukraine is challenged and they have to attrit the Russian forces at that kind of rate, which is why, they're working so hard to keep that rate to about 1,000 a day. And then it means that the Russian new forces, they are able to send in reinforcements to areas, but effectively they're not rotating forces. They're not having enough in reserve to be able to train forces adequately, keep them in reserve, and then rotate them onto the front line. And those people on the front line then moving back in rotation to the reserves to recuperate. What's happening instead is the people on the front line are dying, and then newbies are sent straight in with very little training at all. And there is no rotation, is generally the understanding. Right, volunteer group is Russian drone maker ramps up production despite sanctions, leaks show. So these are volunteer groups creating drones, are not having a problem, it seems, getting hold of components. And there are these sort of very mixed messages coming out. There's some people saying, do you know what, the sanctions are working, they are doing pretty well, the Russians are finding it more difficult. And then reports like this showing, oh my goodness, they've ramped up production on a voluntary basis, which means that this isn't even going through like commercial channels, which you think it's probably easier to get components on these, doing mass deals and whatnot. You've just got people making these in their back rooms and being able to do a good job. Anyway, Russian manufacturer of all-round drones and other military use equipment dodges sanctions. So that's not the volunteer group. I wonder what the volunteer group is then referring to. Successfully increasing production. They've dodged sanctions to obtain foreign-made components. The Ukrainian volunteer group. That's it. Sorry, Ukraine. No. I take that all back. I should have read that first. The volunteer group is referring to the source, said in its January 12th analysis of the company's leaked data by hackers. So nonetheless, the point remains the same, which is that, there are these mixed messages coming out about the effectiveness of the sanctions. My guess is that sanctions are effective, and it makes it harder for the Russians to get components, but they still do get the components. And maybe not all of the components, and it may come at them at a higher price, but they eventually sort of find their way around these issues. Right, so this is the new French foreign minister. Their first trip is to Ukraine. So that's good news from the French to signal that Ukraine is a number one priority. Those kind of little things you need to pay attention to. Okay, you're new to the post. Where are you going to go first? Ukraine. Ukraine's where it's at. Now, what I'd love to see is this followed up by action. But nonetheless, new French foreign minister visits Kiev to affirm long-term support. Stéphane Séjourné arrived in Kiev to reinforce France's support commitments to Ukraine, marking his first official visit in his role. Donald Tusk says, I will never allow, he's a Polish premier, never allow anyone in my government to base their position on anti-Ukrainian sentiments. It's a really strong rhetoric again from Tusk. Excellent to hear that no one in his government will be pandering to the Russians at all. On the other hand, there are still issues with the border between Ukraine and Poland. More than 2,000 trucks are in queues. On other parts of the border, about 1,000. Andriy Demchenko, the spokesperson of the State Security Service of Ukraine, has announced, according to the information of the Polish border guards as of this morning, 850 trucks are in queues at the checkpoints of Rawa Ruska Herbene, Kravikets Korchova, and Yahudin Dorohusk. Thanks for making me do that. So, yes, still an ongoing issue. This is now, I believe, with the truckers and not with the farmers. The farmers, I think, have done a deal. So the issue has moved to the truckers again. Right, maybe someone can help me with this. I do get confused about buying public debt and whatnot. David D says, and just like that, China bought Russia. The Ministry of Finance spoke about Russia's desire to place public debt in yuan. It appears that they might be selling off their public debt to China, and that might then give China an awful lot more power over Russia and the ability to pull rather a large number of strings. This goes to the idea that Russia really is a vassal state of the Chinese, something that, interestingly, the Russian politicians have been worried about for the last 20 years. Although people think that China and Russia have this very close relationship because they're ideologically aligned, they aren't really ideologically aligned. China has this really weird version of socialist capitalism, kind of centralized capitalism. It's really interesting when you read into the Chinese market economy over the last 20 years or so. It's its own hybrid version. I know lots of people, like free marketeers, would like to accuse it of being like communist or whatever. It's not. It's this weird. I mean, just all the commercial stuff that's coming out of China and all the Chinese stuff that we buy, there's a lot of free market capitalism going on in China, but it's not that free. So it's this weird hybrid situation. Russia is this oligarchy that is lining the pockets. I'm sure that's happening in China to some degree, but it's definitely happening in Russia, and a lot to do with natural resources, and they have their differences. But as far as their political ideology is concerned, neither of them are really communist, and it's a marriage of convenience. BRICS is a marriage of convenience, and for some time, as far as I understand it, Russian elites and Russian politicians have been worried, and in fact, the intelligence services have been warning the Kremlin about encroaching Chinese imperialism in a way. So Russia has been very wary of China encroaching upon, both physically in terms of terrain over to the east, natural resources, but influence into Russia. But since Russia's been involved in this war with Ukraine, and they've lost all their friends around the rest of the world, broadly speaking, and they're being sanctioned left, right, and centre, they necessarily are having to rely on China more. So all the cars you see in Russia at the moment, all the new cars are Chinese cars. There are so many more Chinese cars on the market, and you look at Vladivostok as a port on the eastern seaboard, and you're thinking, oh, the Chinese are broadly in control of that port now, and so on and so forth. And the influence of China is becoming more and more of an issue for the Russians, and I think effectively Russia is a vassal state of China, and this then leads into that move. Right. Exports from the Czech Republic to Kyrgyzstan. We've seen a very similar map with regard to Germany, but of course they're not the only country. Czech Republic has been exporting an awful lot to Kyrgyzstan, up 1,200% since the Russian army invaded Ukraine. This puts Czechia ahead of Germany, 1,100% Germany's increases are, and behind Poland, 2,200%. So you've got these three countries, Germany, Czechia, and Poland, who are dead against Russia, and real staunch supporters of Ukraine. And it's not the countries themselves, and it's not even those manufacturers of the goods themselves that are to blame. But the problem is those exports are going round a mulberry bush several times and ending up in Russia. That needs to be stopped. EU exports to Kyrgyzstan began booming in March 2022, so really early in the war. This stuff is going to Russia and must be stopped. How you do that is different matter. Militants have captured 4 Ukrainians in Somalia. This was reported by Ukrainian Foreign Ministry spokesman Oli Nikolenko, and the abducted were crew of a UN mission in Somalia, a helicopter that crashed. The identities of the Ukrainians have been already established. 5 foreigners were also on board with them. It's interesting they're still doing UN missions. So I don't, at face value, there's nothing dodgy about this. We know that the Ukrainians are doing special forces operations in Africa. And you might think that why are they spending resources doing that? Those troops should be fighting on the front line in Ukraine. Actually, what they're doing is stopping Russia getting money. So they're making strikes on Wagner PMC, etc., in these areas where they are helping themselves to diamonds, to natural resources, etc., that then funds the war. And so actually it's in Ukraine's best interest to be operating in Africa, away from the front lines of the war in Ukraine, because they are trying to strangle the income Russia gets to fund its war. Right, ship mistaken for a British ship. This goes back to, I don't really want to open this can of worms, but the Houthis have struck a ship that they thought was British, and the ship was actually Russian, traveling in the Red Sea, and I believe it was carrying sanctioned oil as well. So there's a deep irony in this. But it also goes to show that the Houthis aren't really trying that hard to only strike, I don't know, Israeli Zionist ships. Obviously, the UK and US and a number of other countries have been involved in striking Houthis, and so there's going to be retaliation for that. But be under no illusion that what's going on there. Now, I said yesterday that this has very little connection to Israel, and somebody called me out, kind of rightly so, but my point still remains entirely correct. But it just depends which way you're looking at it. What the Houthis are doing is connected to Israel, so they're on the side of Hamas, and they're saying, right, now we're going to start doing that. What the US and UK and Denmark and South Korea and Canada and all these other nations who have been involved in striking the Houthis back, what they did was not to do with Israel. That was my point. So what the US and UK and others did was to support the global economic security and stability, particularly in that region, and to lubricate the trade route, right? They weren't doing that to support Israel. That was my point. Of this has nothing to do with Israel. The strikes themselves, not what the Houthis were doing, that may have to do with Israel, and supporting Hamas and them getting really annoyed. Okay, fair enough. But the strikes back were like, if Israel ceased to exist immediately, they would be doing that to the Houthis. If the Houthis were doing that, of course, whatever. That kind of like hypothetical is a bit problematic because Houthis wouldn't be doing that. Israel ceased to exist. But you get my point. Is that is to do with economics and not to do with Israel. Right. Finally, this is doing the rounds. This is a big rumor that's coming out. I think it's true, but I can't really comment too much on it because I know very little. But I tell you what, those Russian trolls are having a field day. They've been having a field day for 2 days now on my blog, on my YouTube threads. So Gonzalo Lira, who's Chilean US citizen, who has been arrested by the Ukrainians for X, Y, and Z. He's been in prison. The claims were he's been tortured this, tortured that. There was the completely unfounded claims. However, it appears he has died. Ukrainians are claiming for natural causes. The pro-Russian sources are shouting about how he was tortured to death. And then, yesterday on January the 12th, the totalitarian Zelensky regime forcefully vaxxed our brave freedom fighter and vax resistor Gonzalo Lira, leading to his instant death. He will always remain unvaxxed in our hearts. So whatever position you're in, whether you're just pro-Russia, anti-America, anti-Ukraine, anti-vax, whatever, free speech advocate, whatever you're getting behind Gonzalo Lira for, you'll find some support. Never forget, taking the vaccine was a character test. Weaklings, followers, and suck-ups lined up to get the shot. Those who had balls refused, said Gonzalo Lira. The idea might be that they were giving him a vaccine and he had an adverse reaction and he died. I don't know. I had no idea. Edward Hunter Christie says, so apparently low-life clown tells you what he thinks about Gonzalo Lira. I'd agree. Really is dead. His trajectory is well documented. And yet, American pro-Moscow agitators such as Tucker Carlson bent the known facts beyond recognition so as to present Lira as some kind of martyr and so as to demonize Ukraine as it continues to fight a harrowing war for its national survival. This tells us that Tucker Carlson is a deeply evil and perverted man. I broadly agree with that. A Pied Piper for calculated callousness in the face of fascism war. So I don't know whether Tucker Carlson has been getting up in arms about Gonzalo Lira. But here's something I just want to show you very quickly. Right, just to remind you that when Elon Musk took over Twitter, one thing he did was he lost an awful lot of advertising because of allowing people to say what they like, hate speech basically, to come back on Twitter. And in losing advertising, he desperately needed to pick up income. So what he did is he changed the verified blue tick. So the blue tick used to be this thing that you get to prove that you were who you were. So say that you were a famous journalist or a sports player or whatever, and not someone pretending to be you, you would present some verification to Twitter and they would give you a blue tick to say you are who you claim you are. And that was a verification tick. And then what he said is, right, if you want that blue tick, you have to pay for it now. And basically then changed it into it's nothing to do with verification. It is just you're paying Twitter to like whatever dollars it is a month in order to be able to write more stuff and to get the algorithm or to get Twitter to amplify your voice. So you get sent up the list of priorities on the algorithm and you are spread farther and farther, you know what I mean, across the world in terms of your voice, right? So what happened is that Russia went, that's very nice. That's a really good return on investment. We have troll farms. We are going to buy an absolute ton of blue ticks. And you, Twitter, will amplify our voices around the world. And so it turned out that the most people that bought blue ticks, so loads of people reacted against that, but a lot of decent people and verified journalists were like, we don't want to pay Elon Musk to have this kind of privilege, so we are refusing to do that. And you then start getting a skew of people like nefarious, insidious, bad faith actors were overwhelmingly buying blue ticks, blue checks, and decent people weren't. And that skewed the narrative that you were finding on Twitter. And to give you a bit of understanding of how that is the case, here's an example. I just came at Kim.com is someone who is a terrible human being, who is a pro Like Jake Bro was just complaining that Kin.com had blocked him. Anyway, he waxes lyrical about Gonzalo Lira. US citizen, author and journalist Gonzalo Lira died in Ukraine while in detention. He was harassed, arrested and tortured by, there's no evidence he's been tortured, by the Zelensky regime after reporting the truth over the US proxy war. He was placed on a kill list by the Ukrainian government. Stop funding Ukraine. So this is his rationale for stopping funding Ukraine, stopping supporting Ukraine. In other words, this is to the benefit of Russia. The only thing, this is pro-Russian rhetoric. This guy is in the pocket of the Russians, right? Okay. Then when you look down at who supports what he says here, which is everyone on the thread below, you're like, oh, blue tick, oh, blue tick, oh, blue tick, 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 blue tick. Oh my goodness. So when you look down this list, 100% of the people here have blue checks. Partly because all the people supporting him are pro-Russian trolls, and also because they get shunted up the list, or the algorithm puts them to the top of when you're scrolling down because they have blue ticks. And so what you then get is, if you look at a quote like this, if you're just a random, right, that you don't know how Twitter works and you're don't have this understanding, you look at this opinion of Kim.com and you think, oh my goodness, the entire world also thinks the same, because all of these are pro-Kremlin voices shouting about how terrible Ukraine is and how wonderful a human being Gonzalo Lira is. And I'm scrolling down, and I've not seen a single person on here without a blue check. Each one of that, there's that one, aggravated avocado. Wow. Okay. Interesting this. Aggravated avocado. I just donated more to Ukraine. The first person without a tick is the first, or not the first actually. But you look at all of these, they are pro-Russian. So I think this is a really interesting little look into how Twitter works as an information space, how blue checks work, and how the Russians work themselves. He seems like a good guy. R.I.P. Elon Musk, you need to know about this. There must be justice for this murder. Rest easy, Gonzalo Lira. You know, all of these are pro-Russian voices, and they all have blue ticks, blue checks, and they're all having their voices amplified by the algorithm that Twitter uses, and it's not cool. I don't know what happened to Gonzalo Lira, and maybe something dodgy did happen, but if I don't know what happened, I'm pretty sure these guys don't know what happened either. And to very, very explicitly make the claims that some people are making about what happened to Gonzalo Lira is to basically peddle propaganda. I will sit on the fence and say, I don't know. We'll wait to see what finds out, but I'm not going to just say what happened because I want it to be true, which is what most of these people are doing. Take care, speak soon.